Hello, everyone. Welcome to another one of our Avatar Bible studies. Today we are in episode 8 of Book 1, the second part of the Winter Solstice episode, that is referring to Avatar Roku. If you can turn to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6, we're going to be discussing the topic of faith in today's study. Hebrews 11:6, but without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Faith. It's a word that's given a lot of meanings, but it actually only has one. It's a word that's given one area of application, but actually has many. And it's a word that people think will always be rewarded in this life. But that's rarely the case in reality. In this life, anyway. Today's episode of Avatar is going to illustrate all of these things beautifully, and we're going to use today's episode to help outline the same point that the author of Hebrews was making about the definition, applications, and consequences of faith. And for those of you who are currently a part of Christianity, considering Christianity, or want to know why make the comparison of Avatar and Christianity at all, I welcome you all here and look forward to discussing these things with you. So, starting with this first topic, the definition of faith. Faith is trust with reason. It's the Greek word that is translated into our Bibles today is the word pistis, which is used to describe confidence or admiration in someone put into action. The more you trust someone, the more reasons you have been given to do so. So, the more reasons you have to trust somebody, the more willing you'll be able to trust them when it's not easy to. That's literally the definition of faith. Now, the Bible gives three examples immediately following the verse that explains why faith is so vital for our relationship with God. It gives three examples in verses 7 through 12 of Hebrews chapter 11. These are in order: Noah, Abraham, and Sarah, Abraham's wife. By faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world, and became heir of the righteousness which was according to faith. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called out to go to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, his sons, heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. By faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age. Big time, by the way. Because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, thanks for the compliment, God, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. Now, immediately following the passage, again to clarify, that faith is really just that vital when it comes to our relationship with God. The author of Hebrews gives three examples. First, Noah, who was living in the ancient world, never knew what rain was like. In the ancient world, according to Genesis 2:4 through 6, the hydrological cycle was a consistent mist rather than sporadic pourings of water based on heat, condensation, and precipitation. So when Noah was told it was going to rain, and rain so hard that it was going to flood, and so to avoid the flood, he'd need to build a boat, Noah's response was with three questions. What's rain, what's a flood, and what's a boat? A lot of reasons to trust what was being said. Although, note this, Noah wasn't going entirely off of a lack of information. It wasn't like the Bill Cosby routine, where just one day a voice was speaking from heaven saying, build an ark, it's going to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. And he's like, right. What's an ark? Am I on candid camera? You know, that whole routine. You can check it out. Either pause the study or visit it after this. But it's worth noting that Noah wasn't in that state of ignorance. According to Genesis 5, Noah was born when Adam, was still alive. He was a man who had a direct face-to-face relationship with God before mankind fell, and so had first-hand knowledge of the kind of God they were dealing with, despite the fact the majority of the planet at the time wanted nothing to do with that God. So note this. He had questions, and he was given answers as far as what was relevant. Okay, how do I build a boat? And he says, I'll supply the needs, I'll supply the instructions, here's the dimensions, everything you'd need to know. But note this as well. He had to trust God when he told him about things he had never heard of. So given the information he already had about God from Adam himself, he trusted God for one reason. And pay attention to this key phrase. He had done things like this before. He made promises and he kept them. Likewise, Abraham was told to leave Ur, which is a city, an ancient city, granted, in southern Iraq, and was told to cross the entire Middle East at the time, to a place he had never been, to receive something he had never had. It's a lot of trust that is required in this. He didn't have kids, but God told him he'd have more kids than stars. He didn't receive he didn't have a vacation home in Canaan. He didn't know where he'd be living. But God told him his children, which again he didn't yet have, would inherit that land. And when he was finally given a son by his wife Sarah, they likewise chose to trust those promises. Why? He had done it before. Before and after Jacob, Abraham and likewise his wife Sarah chose to trust God to keep his promise to their family. Why? He had done it before. Now, I'm saying this over and over again because I want you to note this comparison. Why is this being brought up in light of Avatar: The Last Airbender, Episode 8 of Book 1? Well, why did Avatar Roku, after giving that prophecy, a literal promise of the future from the perspective of someone beyond time, tell Aang that Sozin's comet was coming? He would need to master all 4 elements in an incredibly short amount of time. And again, that was no small task, but Avatar Roku trusted that Aang could do it. Why? Say it with me. He had done it before. That's the definition of faith. You have reasons to trust somebody from prior experience. So, note that then into our second point, the applications of faith. Faith, which again is defined as trust with reason, is the standard for our relationships with not only God, but everyone in our lives. People think, oh, you have faith. That just means you believe. You believe, therefore you have faith. No, you trust somebody as the foundation for any relationship, good or bad. The lack of trust means you're not going to have a positive relationship with them. And an abundance of trust means that you have that kind of solid relationship with somebody. It's not that complicated. But note this as well. The problem isn't that faith plays a role in relationships. It's that you can't really tell unless the chips are down to find out just how far that faith goes. For example, if I'm asking you to quantify faith, to tell me what it's made of, what's its substance, how could we define or describe it apart from when we see it acted upon? Well, it would be a perception of somebody, right? You consider them trustworthy. And notice the word faithful and trustworthy are literal synonyms. They mean the same thing. If they prove themselves worthy of that trust, you see them that way. But I can't test that unless I have the opportunity to, where I have no other choice but to trust somebody. And once again, the Bible gives an example of the kind of man who not only had faith, but had the sort of faith that was demonstrated in action, not just perception. And this, again, brings us back to Abraham. One book of the Bible, in addition to Hebrews, the book of James, written by Jesus' biological half-brother, by the way. James chapter 2 and verse 18, James makes the observation as the leader of the early church. Someone will say, "You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that there is one God. You do well. Even the demons believe, and they tremble." It doesn't mean they have a relationship with God. "But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect or complete. And the scripture was fulfilled which says, Abraham believed God, this is quoting Genesis 15 and verse 6, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, having a right relationship with God. And he was called the friend of God. You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only. Now, James gives a means by which to test authentic faith, and again gives Abraham as the example. Cult groups love to use this statement, by the way, out of context to dismiss faith as the means by which we are saved from the ultimate consequences of our sin, the separation and deviation between us and God's character. But that's not how James presents Abraham. He literally quotes Genesis 15 and verse 6, which established a full 6 chapters before Isaac was born that Abraham was made right with God because his willingness to trust him. But how do we test it? Well, watch how he lives in light of that reality. That's James' point. Cult groups and bad Christian teachers will say, well, Abraham showed his faith by never sinning again, which is wrong. Abraham doubted God immediately 1 chapter after Genesis 15, and this statement was made. He committed adultery with Sarah's maid Hagar, then allowed her to abuse her when jealousy started to grow. That's not a lot of sinlessness happening there. But understand, that's important to note. Saved people with faith still sin. The works that James references prove the faith. They don't create it. Abraham had faith, but demonstrated it as genuine in Genesis 22, where he offered Isaac on the altar. And notice, it wasn't Ishmael or any of his other sons that he would have later on. It was Isaac that he laid on that altar, the son that God said, I would promise to give you more children than stars through him. And Abraham noted, well, he's in his 30s. He doesn't have children yet. So God, either you have a problem that you are going to solve, or you've just created a problem that can't be solved. And so Abraham, and later passages even note, he was willing to believe in a resurrection from the dead, hint, hint, foreshadowing. Same mountain, by the way, that Jesus would be crucified on 2,000 years later, but that being said as well. All of this was taking place, and this, essentially a situation that God put himself in, where either a loophole was going to be created or something else was going to be introduced. This sacrifice, when it was about to be made, formed the established prohibition against human sacrifice, which was all too common in the day and age that Abraham lived in the worship of false gods even today. But this was established by the God of Israel, that his action showed his faith because he knew enough about God to say, you made a promise, you're going to keep it. Therefore, I trust you. Why? Because I know enough about you to act on it. Good example in today's episode was, interestingly enough, General Zhao, Iroh, and Zuko. Zhao didn't know if Zuko had found the Avatar, but he knew enough about him to trust he wouldn't take the risky act of running the blockade unless it was for a good reason. Zuko didn't know that the boat wouldn't explode given the damage it had taken from the flaming catapult, but knew enough about it and all that it had been through beforehand to trust, there's that word again, that it would hold on at least until they made it to the fire temple. Iroh didn't know enough about Zuko's reasons for running the blockade and also violating his father's exile being a good idea. But he knew enough about Zuko's instincts to trust him, as well as he knew enough about his brother to not trust him to be understanding and not, just end the whole thing and jump ship. That's faith in action, a trust that makes a direct impact on your behavior. Which brings us to the last point, the consequences of faith. Our introduction to this study was noted and worded carefully, and I intentionally did it that way. In this life, there's not always a good reward for trusting God. And understand why. This world hates God. It hates his standards. It hates his character. It hates the fact that he still loves them. It hates him, period. It will do anything to snuff out the light in order to live comfortably in the dark that they are used to, and it remains the case today. The continuing passages in Hebrews chapter 11 note examples of people who have trusted God throughout history. And notice how they were repaid. In Hebrews 11 and verse 13, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off. They were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. So note, were they let down? No, but their loss was in this earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had the opportunity to return. I mean, if they wanted to be in this world, they had every opportunity to invest in it. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. A good example of this in today's episode was the fire sage Xiu. By siding with the Avatar, he knew the Fire Nation would imprison him without trial or even good reason. Yet he trusted the sacrifice was going to be worth it. Why? Because even if he was thrown into prison, he'd rather be wronged for doing the right thing than try to do the wrong thing for the wrong people. They were all going to be thrown into prison anyway. And likewise, they were all going to die anyway, whether it was by the hand of the Fire Lord and his executioners, or through the slow decay of time. We all are faced with the same perspective check. Who would you rather be? The 4 fire sages that abandoned the Avatar when the Fire Nation fell, spoiler alert, or the one who trusted him enough, referring to the Avatar, but for us to trust God, to act on it regardless of the consequences in this life. There's more I could talk about regarding Fire Sage Xiu, and he might warrant a study all on his own. There are several parables that he fits nicely into that Jesus told, but I think that suffices to discuss the topics and biblical relevance of today's episode in the context of faith. So I want to thank you all for listening to this study. If you have any sincere questions, ask them. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, do so. But most importantly, if you know someone who perhaps is familiar with Avatar, but not its application towards the discussion of faith, or perhaps just are unfamiliar with faith, and this illustration might help them in solidifying that concept and how it applies to our lives today, please share this study with anyone you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time. Remember that Jesus loves you, and he has far more to offer you than what this world can vainly promise. Because, while it's worth noting, the world doesn't always give us a lot of reasons to trust it. God hasn't failed anyone who's trusted him yet. That's why we have faith. That's why it's the basis of our relationship with him, and why I encourage all of you to not only adopt that sort of faith, but to act on it, and knowing that it is genuine. Whatever the world takes from us, God is fully capable of restoring to us. But that's the key. Are we willing to trust him to do exactly that? God bless you.